the series of our Bachofen lectures, which we organize once a year to get very influential, very important thoughts about anthropology as a discipline to Basel and to discuss and also to listen to our colleagues from afar and also perhaps nearby. Perhaps I should say that it is the first time that I need a stone to introduce somebody, and you will later learn more about why I need a stone to introduce Tim here. Tim Ingold is an extraordinary anthropologist. He studied natural sciences in the beginning before he moved into anthropology, and studied at the University of Cambridge, where he also has made his PhD in 1976. Since then, he has been one of the most productive colleagues that we have, and also with regard to many different fields. I will tell you a little bit more about the various fields so that he is active in a few minutes. And perhaps I should first mention that his first fieldwork, which he conducted for his PhD, was among the Skolsami in northeast Finland, and I also know that he regularly still visits this area of Finland, so that Tim is very much attached to that part of Europe. But he did not only build up anthropology in Finland. Later he became professor at Manchester University in 1990, where he also became Max Gluckman professor in 1995, and 4 years later he moved to Aberdeen, where he built up the Department of Anthropology, a completely new department, and I very much agree to his choice of the title of that department. It's not a department of social anthropology nor a department of cultural anthropology, it is just anthropology. It's because I believe his research interests are very wide and include many basic dimensions of human life. Indeed, one could say that going back to the basics is what characterizes Tim's work. So he worked on the perception of the environment, which is also one of his very influential books, which means how humans interact with the environment, and not only the natural environment, also other environments. He worked about language, technology and practice, architecture and the arts, and I will come back to that in a minute. And he rightly, I believe, says that anthropologists have largely ignored architecture, and we here in the near future want to fill that gap as well. So perhaps that's also one of the reasons we have to listen very attentively to what he has to tell us today. He also worked about creativity, as we would do here, but also on human-animal relations, ecological questions, pastoralism, hunting, and these are only a couple of his fields of interest. He has published 15 books, among them 5 edited volumes, and one of these is of special interest to all of us, and that was the book that he edited in 1996 about key debates in anthropology, which is, though it is already 20 years old, certainly one of the best introductions into these key debates in anthropology. And I sometimes regret that we don't have anything similar in German-speaking anthropology. Perhaps one of the last books that he published is closer to our current interest here. It has the title Making, and I learned when I read it that it is only because the publisher didn't want to have it as 4 A's, because something that it contains a number would be difficult to find on the internet. So it became, and the 4 A's are anthropology, archaeology, art and architecture. These are actually the subjects of the book. I think that the key idea is not only of this book but of Tim's more recent work is that anthropology is not only documentary but transformational. It is, as he wrote, and I quote, "It is surely incumbent for us to give to the future as we have received from the past." End quote. Today, when we met briefly at about noon, Tim said that he reads more philosophers than anthropologists, and I don't think that that is a mistake, and others might complain about it, we don't. I think it is still an advantage to look beyond the disciplinary boundaries of our discipline. His more recent work is always on handwork and what we do with our hands when we, for instance, draw a line, build a house, carve a figure, and so on and so forth. But I needed to find a stone to introduce him, because in one of his recent publications, or it's not quite recent, to 2007, he starts his article with the following sentence. Before you begin to read this article, please go outside and find a larger stone, though not so big that it cannot be easily lifted and carried indoors, which I did. Bring it in and immerse it in a pail of water or under a running tap. Then place it before you on your desk, perhaps on a tray or plate, so as not to spoil your desktop. Well, I don't know whether that will be successful or not. Take a good look at it. If you like, you can look at it again from time to time as you read the article. At the end, I shall refer to what you may have observed. The stone is there and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be able to deliver this lecture, and also to visit your most beautiful city, which Till showed me around a bit this afternoon, and it's a lovely place, and I'm very envious of you all. We have the fog of the North Sea. But anyway, my title is One World Anthropology. An anthropology, for me, is a generous, open-ended, comparative, and yet critical inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of life in the one world we all inhabit. That is my definition of anthropology. It is generous because it is founded on a willingness to both listen and respond to what others have to tell us. It is open-ended because its aim is not to arrive at final solutions that would bring social life to a close, but rather to reveal the paths along which one can keep going. It is comparative because it acknowledges that no way of being is the only possible one, and that for every way we find, or for every way we resolve to take, alternative ways could be taken that lead in different directions. So, even as we follow a particular way or path, the question, why this way rather than that, is always at the forefront of our minds. And it is critical because we cannot be content with things as they are. By general consent, the organizations of production, distribution, governance, and knowledge that have dominated the modern era have brought the world to the brink of catastrophe. And in finding ways to carry on, we need all the help we can get. But no one, no indigenous group, no specialist science, no doctrine or philosophy already holds the key to the future if only we could find it. We have to make that future for ourselves, but that can only be done through dialogue. And anthropology's role, then, in my view, is to expand the scope of this dialogue to make a conversation of human life itself. But that we do indeed all inhabit one world is, in my view, a core principle of our discipline, and is one that we neglect at our peril. I am afraid that in practice, it has all too readily been neglected, along with the challenges and responsibilities it entails, in favour of a facile appeal to plurality. It sometimes seems that anthropologists are constitutionally averse to oneness, to singularity, and likewise obsessed with the plural. Never one world, always many worlds. Once, these were the many worlds of symbolic culture. Now, in the wake of the so-called ontological turn, we have the many worlds of essential being. Everyone and everything, it seems, is its own world. You name it, and there's a world for you. But what do we mean by plurality? And in what sense can plurality be opposed to singularity? This question of how to reconcile the singular and the plural, or in slightly different terms, the universal and the particular, could, I think, turn out to be the central problem of a truly philosophical anthropology. So let me offer an example. People living in the high Arctic, mainly in northernmost Canada and Greenland, know themselves and are known as Inuit. And this word Inuit is the plural form derived from the singular Inuk. And Inuk means soul. In a modern idiom, we might suppose that every soul belongs to an individual, and therefore that the plural Inuit simply denotes a population of individuals. Greenland and Canada, we say, have their respective Inuit populations. We could do a census and count them up. But I don't believe that for the people themselves, souls could be counted or enumerated in this way. That we couldn't say how many there are, 10, 20, 500. Rather, the plural suffix, which usually followed a place marker, meant something like soul life going on in and around this place. For example, a group of Inuit is called Netsilik, and in the plural, Netsilingmiut. And the Netsi bit refers to the place, miut is the plural. So how do you get from one to the other, from the life of the soul to soul life? Not by multiplication, or not at least in the arithmetic sense that is familiar to us from elementary school. Nor, conversely, do you get from soul life to the life of the soul by division. Call the plural a multiplicity if you must, but don't suppose that it is a multiplication of the singular. Because every particular life, every particular soul, is not an entity sunk inexorably into itself. That is to say, it is not an object, in the sense recently promulgated by the advocates of object-oriented ontology. In their view, everything you might care to name has its own inscrutable essence, neither reducible to more elementary particles of which it and other things might be constituted, nor soluble into constructs at some superordinate level of existence. Now, admittedly, the soul is amenable neither to reduction nor to totalization. But this does not make it an object. It is more fundamentally, I think, a movement. A movement which takes the grammatical form not of the noun or the pronoun, but of the verb. And the most outstanding characteristic of this movement is that it carries on, or keeps on going. For Inuit people, it even carries on over generations. As a grandchild, for example, is animated by the soul of its grandparent, leading parents to address their children sometimes as they would address their own parents, and to treat them with corresponding deference and respect. So the idea of early years, as though children were closer to some imaginary point of origin in a process of socialization, makes no sense in that Inuit perspective. Everyone, at any moment, is both older and younger than themselves. So souls, lives, if you will, are movements. And to echo the famous aphorism of Heraclitus, one cannot step twice into the life of the same soul. What then is the relation between the life of the soul and soul life? Or, to put it more generally, between a particular life and life itself? Is it a relation between parts and whole? Well, I have nothing against the idea of life as a whole, but I would insist that this whole should not be regarded as a totality. Holism is one thing, and anthropology is very attracted to it, but totalization is quite another, and it is vital to acknowledge their distinction. Totality, to my ear at least, implies addition and completion. So whether or not you consider the result to be more than, or equal to, or even less than the sum of its parts, the logic of summation remains. But life itself is never complete, nor, as I've tried to show, can one approach it by any process of summation, whether that be additive or multiplicative. It's not a completion, but a continual origination. Life, as one elder among the Cree people of First Nations people of northern Canada told the ethnographer Colin Scott, life is continuous birth. It is the generative potential of a world that is forever worlding. So, is the particular life a part of life as a whole? Can we say that the life of the soul is part of soul life? And again, I have nothing against the idea of lives as parts, but then we should think of these parts not as the components of an assembly, but as the voices of a composition. And the analogy that I have in mind here is that of polyphonic music, in which every voice or every instrument carries on in its own particular melodic line. In music, the relation between parts and whole is not summative. It is neither additive nor multiplicative, it is contrapuntal. So we have different lines. There's one line of music might be going on like this, there's another line of music that's going on like that, and the third one in the middle going on like that. So there's a series of contrapuntal movements that are carrying on together and continually responding to one another. And I want to think of lives as lines in counterpoint, as movements that even as they issue forth are continually attentive and responsive to one another. They are, as we might say, answerable to one another. And that's a condition that carries entailments of both responsiveness and responsibility. And that's why I rather dislike the notion of assembly, or assemblage, as it is fashionably rendered through awkward translation from the French. The logic of the assemblage is additive. It is and. We go on adding things in, maybe one thing here, and another thing here, and another thing there, and that is an assemblage in which you keep adding extra bits on. And that's how it was famously articulated by Gilles Deleuze in Mille Plateaux, 1,000 Plateaus. But in music, the parts are not components that are added on to one another. They are rather movements that carry on alongside one another. And lives lived in with movements that carry on alongside one another. And the operative term here is not and, but with. Being is always being with. And so lives lived in counterpoint are not and, but with. And in answering to one another, they correspond. They respond mutually. So in place of the assemblage as a way of talking about the multiplicity of soul life, I propose the term correspondence. Life as a whole, then, is not a summation, but a correspondence of its particulars. And it follows that the relations that make up the whole are not between, but along. Here we might talk about relations between this bit and this bit and this bit. But here, the relations are longitudinal. They're carrying along with the movements. So betweenness gives us the idea of intersubjectivity, a reciprocal back and forth exchange between positions. But the alongness of correspondence doesn't go back and forth, but side by side, like companions walking together or playing music together. And the thing about walking and playing is that it doesn't issue from a position, but continually takes one out of it. I mean, imagine simply two people walking along the street side by side. This is an air view, so there's the head, and that's the nose. The nose gives you the position. So they're walking along like this, and they're walking along like that. They are not facing one another like that. Because if you were facing one another, you couldn't go anywhere, because you'd simply bump into the other person. You can't walk along in the same direction like that. As the philosopher Jan Maschlein, a philosopher of education, Jan Maschlein has put it, walking along continually pulls one out of position, and that is a practice of exposure. Exposure literally means out of position. Now, the English language has a beautiful word, longing, to describe the practice of going along. In longing, an imagination that lies beyond the horizon of conceptualization loops proleptically back to meet an origination that lies beyond the reach of memory, as in the cycling soul life of the Inuit, in a place that we continually strive for but never reach. We long for that we cannot conceptualize, that we cannot imagine, and we think of that as something in the future, but in longing for it, we also think it's in the past and somewhere beyond what we can remember. So what is beyond what we remember in the past is also beyond what we can imagine in the future, and they loop back and meet up. In a workshop that we held in Aberdeen a couple of years ago, the mathematician Ricardo Nemirovsky gave us a wonderful demonstration of what this means in practice. In a nearby park, we laid out a rope. It's about 200 or 300 meters of rope, in the exact form of a parabola. Its ends diverging to infinity, or actually in practice to where our rope ran out. So we laid out the rope like this, like that, on this rather flat field. It was a playing field, so it was nice and flat. We then viewed that parabola through a vertical sheet of perspex. So we had the sheet of perspex here, we looked through the perspex at the parabola lying out there on the grass. And we drew the line of the rope on the perspex with a felt pen. And what did we find? We found that the line we had drawn was actually an ellipse. That's, the mathematics of this is the mathematics of conic sections, and very straightforward. But the point is that those two ends of the parabola that deviate to infinity, when you look through the perspex, actually at infinity, they close up. You have a loop. And with this demonstration in mind, let me return to the problem of universality. What can it mean to say of the one world that it is universal? And how does it relate to the particular, or to the relativity of the particular point of view? Well, I think it means that we have to think of difference. Difference, of course, very important for anthropology. We have to think of difference in terms of differentiation rather than diversity. We're used to talking about cultural diversity, but we need to talk about differentiation instead. And this distinction, I think, is critical. And one way to get at it is to reflect upon the meaning of the ground. For were we not always want to say, us anthropologists, that cultural particulars are superimposed upon the ground of universal human nature? Well then, what is the ground? Is it, as the founder of ecological psychology, James Gibson, once put it, is the ground an underlying surface of support on which all else rests? For Gibson, any habitable environment is furnished with objects, much as, and this was his analogy, much as the floor of a room is furnished with furniture, chairs, desks, and so on. So he imagined the ground is like this. So here's the floor of a room, and we'll put some chairs and tables, things on it, cupboards, and so on. So all these different objects are on the floor of the room, and Gibson said that we should think of the ground rather similarly. So here's the ground, and on it are all the features of the environment we might be interested in. A tree, a hill, a boulder, a person, and so on. So there's the ground, and it supports all these things. But a moment's reflection shows that that notion of the ground is deeply paradoxical. Because on the one hand, if the ground is a universal surface of support for every kind of environmental object, well then it should be fundamentally there before all else. But how can that be, on the other hand, when we can only arrive at this surface by excising, by cutting out every variation or particular from the environment of which it is a part, remodeling it as a piece of furniture, and then reconstructing the scene by imagining each piece set down upon a pre-prepared and absolutely featureless floor. I mean, suppose there's a hill. We have someone to cut out the hill, and then suppose here it is, there's this hill thing, and we'll then stick it on the ground underneath. It's a very odd thing to do. But this, of course, is the logic of the stage set, in which all the scenery is placed upon the boards. And difference in this logic is bilateral. As features like hills and trees distinguish themselves from the ground, so the ground distinguishes itself from the features. All difference is thus detached, leaving its diverse fragments, rocks, trees, buildings, scattered upon the stage, rather like severed limbs on a battlefield. The stage and the fragments, then, correspond to two aspects of indifference, to what Gilles Deleuze in his book Difference and Repetition calls black nothingness and white nothingness. That is, fragments, mountains, trees and so on, are indifferent to where they lie on the stage. They could be put anywhere. And conversely, the stage is indifferent to what rests on it. The stage is a stage, whatever you happen to put on it, and the bits are the bits, wherever they happen to be on the stage. And the puzzle for Deleuze is this. In the real world, things like rocks, trees, and buildings are as much of the ground as on it. They are rooted or founded there, they partake of its substance, and they contribute to its texture. And yet, they are distinguishable as the features we are. We can see trees and boulders and so on. How can this be? And Deleuze's answer is that it is in becoming different. One thing may distinguish itself from another without the latter's distinguishing itself from the former. So a streak of lightning, in his example, can show up against the night sky, but the night sky does not show up against the lightning. The distinction here is not bilateral, but unilateral. Or to take another example, imagine that you lift a sheet, a bed sheet, to form a crease. You can pick it up between thumb and forefinger and hold it up like that. And stretch it a bit, you've got a crease in the sheet. And we register the line of the crease, we can see it as something that has an existence of its own, and yet the crease is still in the sheet. It's not as though the sheet has somehow parted company with the crease and sunk back into flat homogeneity, leaving the crease line, as it were, high and dry. Well, like the crease in the sheet, every distinguishing feature is a fold in the ground. That's how you define the fold. And to think of difference in terms of differentiation rather than diversity is to imagine the universal not as a featureless ground, not as a plane of commonality upon which all diversity is mounted like scenery on the stage, but as a surface that is folded and crumpled like the sheet, and from which difference is ever emergent. So in a life of longing, all difference arises from within. It is in that sense interstitial. So it follows that the life of the soul is to soul life as the crease is to the sheet, or, in Deleuze's terms, as the line is to the ground. The line, he writes, distinguishes itself from the ground without the ground's distinguishing itself from the line. And so too, the particularity of a particular life distinguishes itself from the universality of life itself without the universal's distinguishing itself from the particular. That's why I want to call the life process, I'm sorry for this complicated phrase, I want to call the life process one of interstitial differentiation, rather than external accretion. It is because they are bound together internally in the process of their differentiation that things cohere. Or in short, difference unifies even as it splits. Diversity multiplies even as it divides. Now, to us anthropologists, the ontology that gives us the ground of nature as a universal and homogeneous substrate upon which are set the fragmentary forms of cultural diversity will be immediately recognizable as that of naturalism, Western naturalism. We have the ground of nature and we put all these cultural bits and pieces on top of it. Now, what Deleuze gives us, and what I've tried to express here, is something more akin to the ontology of animism. So this is to contrast animism with naturalism then, but not at all along the lines suggested by my friend and colleague Philippe Descola in his magnum opus recently translated into English as Beyond Nature and Culture. And to shed more light on what I mean by one world, I'd like to compare my view of the naturalism-animism contrast with Descola's. So here's a bit of rather technical stuff about naturalism and animism, if you bear with me. There's one characteristic of animism, Descola writes, that everybody can accept. And this is, and I quote, the attribution by humans to non-humans of an interiority identical to their own. He means that we give these non-humans a soul or something, some animating principle, like we have. So by this he means that plants, and especially animals, are taken to be endowed with souls which enable them to act normatively and ethically as social beings, just as we humans do. Against this homogeneous sea of souls common to all animate beings, there stands the diversity of exterior physical bodies that gives each particular soul its executive armature and allows it to function in the world in the particular way it does. So we have what seem to be different creatures. We have bears, we have caribou, we have humans, and they have their different physical appearances that enable them to live a caribou kind of life, or a bear kind of life, or a human kind of life. But inside all of these are souls, which are basically soul. A soul is a soul, and it doesn't make any difference whether you're a bear or a human or a caribou, and you can easily switch from one to the other anyway. And in this regard, Descola thinks that animism is the perfect inverse of naturalism, which is a Western thought that we're accustomed to, which gives us a diversity of forms of spiritual life, or what we moderns call diverse cultures, set against the backdrop of a homogeneous physical nature. So with animism, you see, you've got one form of interiority, that's the soul, which is shared by all beings, but diverse physicalities. But with Western naturalism, we have diverse cultures, diverse forms of soul life, if you like, imposed upon a universal physicality. So the two seem to be the exact opposite. Or, in a nutshell, whereas animism is a combination of similarity of interiorities and dissimilarity of physicalities, naturalism is the combination of the similarity of physicalities and the dissimilarity of interiorities. But yet surely, so far as living things are concerned, natural science tells us, quite to the contrary, that things, beings, living things, come in innumerable kinds, known as species, and that even within species, there are subspecies, if you perhaps, and anyway, every individual is a little bit different from every other. So there's no similarity there. Moreover, the same science, though now masquerading as psychology rather than biology, also tells us that all humans are identical in their possession of a sense of self. And that sounds pretty much like interior similarity in Descola's terms. So it turns out that naturalism, this sort of Western view that underpins the natural sciences and psychology, naturalism could be defined just as well by the combination of physical dissimilarity and interior similarity as by its opposite. Because in the same breath that it imagines human cultural diversity to be written upon a tablet of universal nature, it also pictures biodiversity as reflected in the mirror of a universal humanity. And if that is so for naturalism, then how can it any longer be distinguished from animism? After all, if we follow Descola, under animism, humanity is extended to all beings, deemed to be in identical possession of interior soul stuff, while the physicality of bodies is infinitely diverse. So it seems that naturalism reveals a world of interiority that is just as homogeneous as the lively and inspirited world that animism gives us, and it simultaneously reveals a world of physicality that is just as replete with variation as is the phenomenal world of animism. But this doesn't mean, of course, that animism and naturalism are one and the same. The point is rather that compared with the similarities and differences of animism, the similarities and differences of naturalism are of another kind. Naturalism's similarities are of identity rather than continuity, and naturalism's differences are of diversity rather than differentiation. Now, to equate similarity with identity is to assume an already divided world populated by discrete, self-contained entities whose properties are to be compared. We imagine a world that's full of all these things, of different marbles, and we say, well, are these marbles similar or different? Well, we look and see whether some of them maybe have X's and some of them have Y's. But in order to talk about similarity in terms of identity and say all the X's are identical and all the Y's are identical, we already start with a world that is cut up into these discrete entities whose properties are to be compared. So a property that is universal is then understood as one that is common to every entity, and one that is particular is limited to a narrower class of entities, or perhaps even unique to a single entity. Or in short, where similarity equals identity, the universal is a kind of lowest common denominator. And diverse particulars are properties that have already precipitated out from the matrix of their generation. But in the world according to animism, things are not already formed, but ever forming as concentrations of vital materials and energies that are and must remain perpetually in circulation. So everything that is, or we might better say everything that occurs, is immersed in the flow. So it's all very well to speak with Descola of the interiority of soul life, but this is not an interior that is set over and against the exteriority of bodies. It is rather the interiority of a life that is immanent in the world itself, and that participates directly in its relations and processes. So let's call that the interiority of immanence. And quite contrary to an interiority that is opposed to the physicality of the exterior world, the interiority of immanence runs seamlessly into physicality, rather like the singular surface of a Möbius strip, without any breach of continuity. In fact, such interiority could be no more distinguished from physicality than can the form of an eddy in the stream be set apart from its substance. So in Descola, say you've got here is a being, here is this interiority inside here, and here is the exterior body, which wraps it up. But if you were an eddy in the stream, here is the substance, and you can't say this is inside or that is outside. The physicality and the interiority run directly into one another. So it's the logic of naturalism operating behind the scenes in Descola's account that has somehow contrived to wrap every being up into itself, so converting the generative currents of its formation into a vital agent or a soul that is somehow supposed to inhabit an interior divided off from the exterior world of its interactions with others. So if you like, the differences of animism manifesting on the plane of immanence are like the growing shoots of a rhizome. Those of naturalism have broken off from the current of life and lie strewn upon that plane of indifference that we commonly recognize as nature. The first kinds of differences are emergent and interstitial. The second kind are resultant and superficial. So whereas animism gives us a world of becoming, naturalism gives us a world of being. One is in the making, the other ready-made. And in my call for a one-world anthropology, I am not appealing to a naturalistic ontology of identity and diversity, but to an animistic ontology of continuity and differentiation. So the universal is not a lowest common denominator, but a field of continuous variation, not a plane of indifference upon which diversity is overlaid, but a plane of immanence from which difference is ever emergent. Okay, Sorry, it was all very technical, but I hope I haven't lost you completely. The next stage in my argument is to relate this principle of interstitial differentiation to the problem of agency. Although I've not really worked this out in detail, I want to suggest that there is an intrinsic connection between the question of how to reconcile the singular and the plural, or how to reconcile the life of the soul with soul life, and the question of how to relate agency and its opposite, patiency, the agent and the patient, or in other words, action and suffering. These seem to me to be alternative ways of posing what is fundamentally the same question. So let me begin by being explicit about what has been implicit in my argument all along, namely that by the life of the soul, I mean that of the person, and that by soul life, I mean social life. The life of the person is made up of doings. Social life, by contrast, is what the person undergoes. And in the grammar of most modern Indo-European languages, there is a distinction between the active and the passive voices of the verb. The active voice is for what one does, the passive is for what one undergoes. And the question then is not whether we should think of life entirely in the active or entirely in the passive sense, nor is it simply a question of the interplay of agency and patiency, of the active and the passive. More precisely, it is a question of whether we frame undergoing inside doing, or whether we frame doing inside undergoing. Now, our usual habits of thought, conditioned as they are, though of course not determined by grammatical categories, put the agency of the person out in front as the sovereign initiator of his or her actions, as opposed to the exterior world in which these actions have their effect. I am going to draw on the board, I do an action, and there's an effect in the world. So my agency stands out in front, initiates the action, which then has its physical effects in the world. Thus we set the agency of the particular life against the passive backdrop of life in general. But the principle of interstitial differentiation suggests, to the contrary, that the doings of every particular life continually emerge and distinguish themselves from within the plane of immanence that is life itself. And that is to frame doing within undergoing, rather than vice versa. Now, another way of putting this might be to think of everything that we do as a task. Because the thing about a task is it's a kind of doing that falls to us as part of the life we undergo. Because we are undergoing life, there are tasks that fall to us and we have to do it. So we need to find a way of talking about the agency that is inside the undergoing of life. And with our existing dichotomy between active and passive voices of the verb, this is very difficult to do. However, many non-Indo-European languages, as well as Indo-European language in earlier times, such as, for example, classical Greek, recognized what linguists call the middle voice of the verb. Not active, not passive, but a middle voice. In the middle voice, agency is inside the action, inside the verb. It's inside what I do. It's not something that stands outside and initiates it, but is inside the doing. Or as the linguist Emile Benveniste put it in a classic paper, in the middle voice, the doer achieves something that is being achieved in him. And my suggestion is that in the one world of becoming, of interstitial differentiation, life is lived neither in the active voice nor in the passive voice, but in the voice of the middle. With life lived in the middle voice, our focus can no longer be on the essence of being, but on its ongoing generation. That is to say, it should be not on, the focus should not be on ontology, but on ontogeny. Not on the essence, but on the generation of being. Myself, I don't like the idea of turns, and I get fed up when people keep talking about whether we've got this turn or that turn and trying to find out who's turning where and catching up with them all. I think that the turn is a fancy way of branding academic produce. But if we must have a turn, or if we must have such things as turns to indicate transitions in our thinking, then I would want a turn that is not ontological, but ontogenetic. With multiple ontologies, everything or every being is its own world, and there seem to be as many worlds as there are beings or things. But with multiple ontogenies, every being or thing issues forth along its own particular path, within one world of unlimited differentiation. Or in short, ontogenesis allows us to reconcile singularity and multiplicity, or agency and patiency within one world. There is, as the philosopher Alain Badiou has put it, only one world, but it is a world that refuses any normative preconditions for existing in it, such as might be entailed in any naturalistic definition of universal humanity. I mean, how many times have we tried to define human nature in terms of the common possession of this or that attribute? Maybe it's bipedalism, or maybe it's tool making, or maybe it's symbolic thought, or maybe it's reason, that we try and find something that all humans have, only to discover that there are creatures born of man and woman who don't happen to have it, that there are cripples, people who can't walk on 2 feet, that there are people who can't make tools, that there are people who maybe can't think in symbolic terms or think rather differently from that, and who therefore find themselves excluded from our definition of humanity. The one world we inhabit, then, is a world of ever-emergent difference which admits no boundaries of inclusion or exclusion. And I think anthropology should be fighting intellectually and politically for the recognition of this kind of world. Writing over a century ago, the philosopher William James called it a pluralistic universe. And much more recently, our anthropological colleague Arturo Escobar abbreviated this to pluriverse. The pluralistic universe becomes pluriverse. So compared to the one world of corporate globalization, of British Airways, such things, in which everything is reduced to liquid commensurability, the evolving pluriverse, Escobar writes, and I quote, might be described as a process of planetarization articulated around a vision of the Earth as a living whole that is always emerging out of the manifold biophysical, human, and spiritual elements and relations that make it up. So in our terms, the plurality of the pluriverse is not a multiplication or a division, but a differentiation of the singular, of the living whole. And it is to the one-worldness of the whole, I believe, that anthropology must remain committed. But for that reason, too, I have my doubts about the anthropological propensity always to want to put standpoints or perspectives or views within their social, cultural and historical context. Every time I hear an anthropologist saying, we have to understand X by putting in it its social, cultural, and historical context, I feel a kind of yawn of fatigue coming over me. It's like laying them to rest, putting them to bed, so that we can no longer engage with them directly. Embedding things in context implies an already completed socialization. Okay, we put them in their context now, good night. But if we open up this moment of socialization through a reverse movement of disembedding or of disinterment, it turns out, this moment of socialization, to be nothing less than the process of social life, or of soul life itself. So what we had closed off and buried by resort to context embraces all that we need to understand. So ontogeny, the skeleton in the ontological cupboard, needs to be brought out and restored to the foreground. And with it, processes of education, long and I think unjustly marginalised in an anthropology that remains obsessed with the shapes and forms of mature thought, should be restored to the centrality they deserve in our discipline. It's not enough to say that amongst this people or those people, everybody thinks this way or that way. How did they come to think this way or that way? And what do the children have to say about it? We can then see that every particular life is both an exploration of the possibilities of being that our one world affords and a contribution to its ongoing formation, that is, to its worlding. It is, in this sense, a never-ending quest for an answer to the question of what being human means. Social life is lived in the search for the answer, not in the enactment of its solution. Responding to the question, we respond to one another. That is, we correspond. And in this, we don't look out from a standpoint, but long for one that is forever beyond our reach. Life, it seems to me, is a question that has no answer. But in this one world of ours, we are all tasked with looking for it. And it's in the search that all social life is lived. And it's just as well that there is no final solution, for that indeed will put an end to us all. Thank you very much.
So we have a few minutes for comments, questions, and whatever you would like to ask. And later we have the appeal in front of this board. Please, don't hesitate. I know it was a very dense talk.
I do apologize for all the heavy-duty philosophy.
But even if it was dense, please, Anna.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have probably it's just a question of clarification, but before you introduced the term of ontogeny, or your suggestion of an ontogenetic turn, you said that we should not embrace a naturalistic ontology of identity and diversity, but an ontology of continuity and differentiation.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, this term you introduced of ontogeny, shouldn't it already be in there? Because there is a problem in the very term of ontology, of like stagnant moment or kind of a snapshot of the world, and Genesis would be more appropriate.
That's absolutely right. I mean, that I could have launched it in earlier at that point and said, actually, when we're talking about continuity and differentiation, it means we must be talking about ontogenesis. So it was kind of prefigured at that point and then pulled out explicitly later on. But that's absolutely right.
To keep the tension.
Yes, to keep the tension. Front line, yes. We're pulling things out of hats.
Please. suspects, also there are others. I think that everybody still has a chance to talk to Tim outside when we have the small reception for everybody, and we'll be here minutes before we leave, so don't run away. There's something to eat outside and also something to drink outside. Thank you very much.